Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. There are many misperceptions about refugees. People wonder, why are they in America? Do they really have to leave their home country? And are they going to take jobs from Americans? Today we're going to talk to a leader in the refugee resettlement movement and discover the truth about these resilient newcomers and what they're really like. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Dana Dahl, Community Outreach Coordinator for the Refugee Resettlement Program of Lutheran Social Services of Michigan. They provide sponsorship, immigration assistance, legal, and resettlement services. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you.
We hear a lot about refugees, and we hear about immigrants. Can you tell us the difference between a refugee and an immigrant?
Sure. Immigrants could be leaving their own country for the same reason that refugees do. Maybe they have their own set of fears, whether it's personal or in their family or something like that, and then they come and live here. But immigrants can also come to our country just for a better life for their family, whether it's an economic opportunity or a job opportunity or anything along those lines. Whereas to be a refugee, you have to be recognized by the United Nations that you have a well-founded fear of returning home. So refugees who come here are not just looking for a new opportunity for their family or a step up from where they are right now in their own country. They're actually coming here because they have no option of returning home in the near future.
How do refugees actually get chosen, and how do they get that status that says that they cannot return to their country?
Usually a refugee is applying for refugee status when they leave that first country, their home country. That's typically how it works. So when they end up in a refugee camp, they have to apply to the United Nations first to be a refugee, to be recognized as a refugee. And then as far as resettlement goes, that's a separate process where they can actually apply for resettlement in whatever country that they want to apply. So, refugees might be applying to go to Australia or the United States. The United States has the largest program in the world, I believe, by quite a bit. But there are different countries that they can apply to.
So my image of a refugee camp is sort of low services. I don't picture a post office in the refugee camp, but maybe I'm mistaken. When you say apply, I think pen and paper and mail or computers. Does this exist in refugee camps so that you can apply easily, or is it difficult?
Right. There are big differences in refugee camps because there are certain refugee camps that have been there for over 20 years, and there are other refugee camps which have just sprung up in a neighboring country where a new conflict has erupted. And so what the application process looks like is you'll usually see it could either be a permanent structure or a temporary structure like a tent. And then you'll see a family on this side of the table and then an interviewing person on this side of the table. And that family is telling that person their story. And a lot of times those facts have to be cross-checked as well.
So there's quite a rigorous system.
It's very rigorous.
It's actually not easy to get refugee status,
is it? No, it's not easy at all. I believe out of all the displaced people in the world, it's actually less than 1% that actually gets permanently resettled to another country. It's a very small number.
Some refugee programs have a church model where obviously then communities of faith are really invested in helping to resettle a refugee family. What does that look like to have a church model?
Sure. And this is the age-old kind of model that I think still resettlement works the best in. I think the only question is if we can find churches or not. But what church co-sponsorship looks like is usually we'll go and visit a church and we will ask them, have you ever resettled a family before that is a refugee? Are you interested in doing that? Do you think you have people in your church that might be interested? So usually to get our foot in the door, we ask to either come present during a church service or maybe an adult Sunday school afterwards or something like that. And then usually what we're hoping for is that there'll be a core group of people from that church that will say, yes, I'm really interested in resettling this family. So what that might look like is maybe a mega church of 10,000 people. They might find 60 people throughout the year, and they'll be able to resettle 6 families throughout the year. Or we find a tiny little Lutheran church with 150 members, but they have such a family kind of feel and model to them already that they all really embrace that family that comes in. And so it actually works well both ways. But what we like to see is that they are there from the very beginning when the family arrives at the airport. They help us go back to the refugees' home right away. They watch what orientation is like and everything like that. And then in those first 6 months especially, that's the crucial window of when a lot of things need to happen, whether it's applying for Social Security cards, getting the kids enrolled in school, getting the adults enrolled in English classes, finding jobs, because there's a big focus on finding jobs very quickly, that the church really assists with all of those things. And usually within a church, they also split up in teams of people because everybody has different gifts, and they can kind of all find their way of being involved with the family.
What is the hardest part for a refugee family? Is it the employment, the language, the housing?
It really depends on the family because we have such a huge difference in refugees who are coming in. We will have very urban refugees who are Congolese refugees. They're well educated. They're coming from the capital of Uganda. They may have been living there for however many years. And so when they come, it's more of like a cultural adjustment, but their English is already there because they were speaking it in Uganda. They already have work experience because they were already doing that because they were in a city center. But it's just more of a cultural adjustment and finding a job that fits them well, or maybe furthering their education if that's their goal. But then we might also have a Korean family from Burma who comes in to the country, and they may not even be literate in their first language, which is a really big jump even for learning English, because sometimes it means if you're learning English, you might even forget some of your first language if you're not literate in that language. And so the barriers that family faces might be completely different and also much more overwhelming in some ways. But then it also depends on each family. We have some families who grew up maybe in a refugee camp since they were young, and so that's all they knew. But we have other families who come in and they've experienced very traumatic things, whether it's torture or rape or victims of other persecution. And so that's all a psychological piece that they have to deal with when they come here.
What is the motivation for churches to pick up this kind of commitment?
I think in a lot of ways, churches, once they really realize what the story of the refugee is, if they think about Jesus himself, he was a refugee in a lot of ways. And so it's really the ultimate form of Christian hospitality that you can offer to someone. For all of the biblical stories that say, invite that person that's not going to be able to invite you back, that may be very true for a lot of families when they're first resettled here. They may have very little to give, but in what they do have to give, they always do. And churches, when they get involved, always experience that hospitality right back. But I think the motivation to get involved is it's in some ways too, it's very different from a mission trip. A church can go overseas for 2 weeks and have these great experiences and come back and process them and talk about them. But getting involved with a refugee family is very different because they may have the exact same qualities as the people that you're working with overseas on these mission trips, but they're living in your own community and in your own neighborhood. And there's more of a tension, but also a learning curve of what it means to work cross-culturally in your own community and cross also social and economic boundaries as well.
I would guess that some of their cultures are more community-based. And what do they find out about American culture?
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, when we do ask our refugee clients kind of these sort of questions, they often do start with, I'm glad I'm here because I'm free from fear and my family is safe. But then there's always a but, because like you said, most families and most individuals are coming from cultures where community is really everything. And so what's shocking to a lot of refugees when they come here is the fact that they might not know their neighbors for a long time, whereas back home, all of your neighbors, a lot of people's business because you're living so close together as well in refugee camps. But there's a lot of isolation here, and that's why we find it really important to actually place refugee communities next to each other and among each other, just because they really need that kind of social support when they first come here. Otherwise, it can be very, very daunting and very isolating.
Do you ever sense that there's a backlash then amongst the majority community here that says, yeah, I know, refugees come in and then they just all stick to themselves, or they really don't want to be American, they don't want to assimilate.
I think in some ways there are some misunderstanding just on a whole in our community of where refugees are living and why they're all in, maybe certain apartment complexes and seem to be kind of grouped together. So local businesses would probably notice that more than anyone. But again, I think the people who are least understanding in the community of why it plays out this way are people probably who haven't traveled. Just because if you're an American and you're traveling overseas, there are times that if you see another American, you're going to latch onto that person because you can talk in your first language as quickly as you want.
They become a friend, even though they're not a...
Yeah, you might have absolutely nothing in common except for the fact that you speak the same language, and maybe you're both from the Midwest and you speak your own dialect together. And so I think the people that are most understanding of why refugee communities form the way they do are those who have traveled or lived overseas themselves.
The majority population really needs to understand how restful that might be to actually be with people who speak your language and know your culture. But then it could also be a crutch, it seems to me, than not to learn how to branch out into the wider culture.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in some ways it's really unfortunate, but our refugee program is kind of set up to do this with communities, just because really the main goal of the United States Refugee Resettlement Program is to get people employed as soon as possible. But what that means is for the very fortunate people who might be able to, get some extra certifications and move on into a field that they've already worked in their former country, well, that might mean that they're really integrating, whether they become a professor or whether they, get back into business. But a lot of our clients who come are, they don't speak English right away, and they might not have a lot of work experience. So they are getting the lower rung jobs, whether it's a meat packing plant or whether it's, working in some sort of agricultural industry. But then what happens is these people are working such long hours that, for one, you can't continue to go to English classes at night because you've already worked a 9-hour day, and you might have an hour commute depending on where you're working. But then also you're working with other people who might speak your own language. And so it's much harder for people to integrate that way. But in a way, we've kind of set them up for that just because of employment being our main focus.
Is there any hope? Do you see people who have then gone back into their professions? Let's say they're an engineer.
Yes, and I would say in the clients that I've known since I started my job, there's just a handful of them that stick out. There's one refugee who came as a Congolese refugee. He came from Uganda. He was in sort of the IT business in Uganda, and when he got here, he was able to get a job at Best Buy and actually went back to Grand Valley and is continuing his education. We're just really excited for him just because we knew from the very beginning that he's really going to go places, whereas the other part of the story is that there are refugees who are also going to make it, but it might take them a few years to get their bearings, to, just get settled with their family, to make sure they can pay their own bills. But then, they start taking classes at night again. And then before you know it, they're getting their degree and getting into a field that they really care about.
So this first 6 months is very important, and you actually, as Lutheran Services, have interns that come in, and you even have international interns, isn't that right?
Yes. It was a very unique situation this summer.
What happened?
Yeah, so I think it was actually in May that I got an email from a couple of French girls saying that they were from some business school in France and that they wanted to come work with us for the summer, and they wanted to intern, and they were just wondering if we were open to that possibility. And I've actually received emails like this before just because my name is out there on our website, but quite often it's people who are asking to be paid to come and work with us, which as a small social service agency, a big one in Michigan, but still limited funding, we just don't have the funding to do that. So I wrote back to them and I said, we would love to have you come, but just so you know, we don't have the funds to pay you. You'd have to pay your own way as well as your living expenses when you're here. And they wrote back and said, yes, this is part of the deal. We've saved our money for it, and we'd love to come. And I said, okay, when are you thinking of coming? And they said June, which was really not that far away. And so I said, okay, and this is just an email exchanges so far. And then I got a call from their professor saying, you need to fax these things to us right away, saying that you're, 501c3. So I was like, okay, this is really legitimate. And so I faxed all these things, and then they showed up the first week of June, and they've been working with us ever since.
And their language skill is actually very important here, isn't it, for refugee work?
Yes, and it's been really great. So they speak French, obviously, and we resettle a lot of Congolese families a lot of the Congolese families, especially the parents, parents speak French as well. So they have been really wonderful, not only for the Congolese families, but also for working with other clients, because they also came here to improve their English and to practice their English. But most of all, they've really helped our clients just learn how to navigate the city on the bus, which is wonderful because it's very time consuming, and it's great that they've been able to do that for so many of our clients.
Well, let's hear from them.
Refugees people are people who suffered a lot, and they just need some help and compassion.
I think it's very hard when you just have to leave your country, not because you want, but just because you have to do it, and just come in a new country when you don't know people, and it's not the same language, not the same culture.
Et your police. Vous allez bien?
Non, ça c'est pas pour l'école.
Non, en fait non, c'est pas pour l'école. C'est plus qu'ils sont inscrits.
C'était difficile pour venir. C'est une longue procédure. Ça prend du temps, ça dure.
She said it's kind of difficult to go in the USA because it takes a lot of time and you have to fill a lot of papers.
So some families are in America, but they still wait for husbands or kids or mother who are still in a camp. And they have a lot of hopes when they come here. And sometimes they're a little bit confusing because they think that they will have a job and they have to apply. To share your time with refugees people is very rewarding because you can learn a lot of different stuff about different culture, but also to learn a lot about yourself because we learn compassion and patience, so this is good for later.
Oh, thank you.
So we just heard that little boy say thank you in English, and it's already just this beginning time in the United States. What have you found with children being such early adapters to the language as they fit into a family where the parents may not be as adaptable on the language skills?
Yes. It has really wonderful implications and really bad ones at the same time, unfortunately. It's really wonderful, the fact that kids can just pick up languages so quickly. It's really amazing, actually. The younger you are, the faster you learn, and it's even hard to detect any sort of accent in a lot of children after they've been here for a few years and they've been in the school system. At the same time, it can be really challenging for parents, just because when the children are learning English faster than the parents and they are adapting to their new surroundings and environment and being able to communicate, sometimes they can try to take the authority role in the home.
The child does.
The child does, and just because they realize that they have that over their parents. And you know, there have been stories that they'll come home from school and say things like, well, in America they don't give homework, that's why I'm not doing any schoolwork at home. Whereas the parents are in this very vulnerable position that they might not have an interpreter for any parent-teacher conferences. And so they're either trusting what their kids are saying, or they're really good in trying to read through it and saying that can't be true, and they're requesting help from somebody else who might know the school system better to help in that sort of exchange. So it's really wonderful that kids catch on so quickly, but sometimes it leads to this power dynamic in the home that can be really challenging for parents to know how to deal with.
So what are the myths that come along with refugee resettlement work,
Sure.
or about refugees in general?
Right. Yeah, I think in a lot of ways when I deal with volunteers or just the community at large, there's sort of this perception that refugees are coming here, they're here to take, they're here because they wanted to come to America, because this is the land of riches, all of these things. And the real truth is that if refugees had the chance to go home, they would go home. They would not come to the United States. And I think that's a huge misconception, that a lot of people think that people are coming here for this great opportunity to be in a new country. Well, while there are truths to the fact that there are wonderful things about being in America, and you know, even if it takes you 5 to 10 years, or even if it's the second generation that benefits, there are huge blessings and benefits of being in this country. But when it really comes down to it, refugees, the whole process of resettlement is sort of a traumatic experience all on its own, just because you might be an adult, you might be a highly respected adult in your own community at home, but when you come here, in all sorts of ways, you feel like a child because you're learning a new language. You're completely dependent on an agency or maybe a co-sponsoring church to fill you in on what it means to live here and how to live here and how to take care of your family in this new country. So it can be very, very challenging. And then also, I think the fact that people think refugees are here to take their jobs, which is also
to take American jobs.
Yes, to take American jobs, which is also not true. Just because we actually do have a very high success rate of people finding jobs, but they're the kind of jobs that nobody else wants, and therefore, I think that's something that people often think about. Like if you'll see a news article posted online about refugees, there are always going to be comments below from the people in the community who think that they're here to
take jobs,
to take resources, and to take jobs.
There is something very admirable about a person who can be this resilient in their life. They've been handed a set of circumstances they didn't ask for. They would like to be living peacefully and happily in their original culture and country, and yet they have to survive and survive for their family.
Yeah.
And so this is actually more admirable than sort of charitable, like we're giving all this instead of saying, what can I learn from refugees about how to be overcomers and adaptable and resilient.
Yes, and just to be clear, when refugees arrive in our country, they already owe the United States government money because they actually pay for their plane ticket. So it's a loan from the government, even for the plane ticket, for them to get here, but they actually have to pay that off eventually in small payments. And so refugees are incredibly resilient, and that's whenever I do a volunteer orientation or a church orientation, I always actually start with the journey of a refugee and what it takes to even become recognized as a refugee, to survive in a refugee camp, and to make it to a new country. I tell you these things as a reminder that these are not helpless people who need our charity. They're people who have already survived amazing odds to get here, and they are very resilient, and they're going to make it.
So how do I get involved? How does a church get involved? How does a civic organization get involved if they said, you know what, I think that this would be a worthwhile endeavor.
Sure.
It's who I want to be as a person, or who I want us to be as a people. What would we do?
Yeah. What I like to do, especially in my role as just community outreach coordinator, is our top goal is always to find groups of people that will partner with one family, just because those are long-lasting relationships that are so healthy in so many ways. Not only are you providing connections to this community that refugee needs, you're also providing this relationship that is so important when you are new in a community. And so for that, if there's anyone that's interested in that, all they have to do is contact organizations in town that work with refugees after their resettlement phase, and they will take you with open arms and introduce you to a family. But what I also like to do is, not everybody has a church family or a group of people that can partner with an entire family and take on that responsibility, because it is a lot of work. What I like to do is sit down with people and just ask, what are your gifts and what are your motivations for getting involved? Because there are certain people that really value the idea of meaningful employment, and to have somebody like that in a refugee's life would make a huge difference. Not only are they finding a job, but they're probably finding a better job than that lowest factory job that's paying minimum wage. And so I really like to partner with people and just discover what their gifts are and how they like to get involved, and really match them up in creative ways.
My sense is that when you give parts of your life to individuals whose lives have all this potential, there's something very satisfying about that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it is the most satisfying work that I've ever done in working in refugee services, just because really the difference of a relationship, of what it means in a new refugee family's life, you will see that every time you meet them. I mean, refugee families are so grateful to meet new people in their community and to just have that relationship. And that relationship is really a platform that they'll really thrive off of. And you'll be able to see that throughout the years.
There's this phrase, sort of drive-by giving, which is Americans are busy and we have some wealth and we are concerned individuals and people. And so we might be willing to sort of give money or funds. But this is a different kind of investment, isn't it?
It is. And this is my biggest challenge, even in working with churches, is that I feel like I've also seen a shift in church culture, that churches used to be much more willing maybe to partner with a family and to make that relational sort of investment, whereas now even in churches, it's much easier for them to say, how about an offering or a clothing drive or something like that, which is all very important. But you're right, my biggest challenge remains finding people who will really invest time, just because time has become more precious than money in a lot of ways for people.
But there's this community building that actually Americans need desperately also. And so by revising our schedules or revising the way in which we order our time, perhaps we could learn something about community if we broke down that sort of distance barrier. I can give clothes, but really what maybe refugee families want are friendships.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I also love about all of our refugee clients, or at least almost all, is that they still live in this sort of culture where you can drop by their house anytime unannounced and they will be thrilled to have you there. Whereas in our culture, they learn very quickly that that's not
make an appointment.
Yeah, that's not very acceptable. But every church that I've spoken with that has ever partnered with a family, I mean, their church has always come out on the other side better for it. Just after learning from another culture, of learning the riches of that culture.
Yes. So benefits on both sides of this equation.
Yes.
My guest today has been Dana Dahl, Community Outreach Coordinator for the Refugee Resettlement Program of Lutheran Social Services of Michigan. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.